What if the most powerful tool related to our health was already in our hands? From sleep scores to blood pressure insights, our bodies are being constantly monitored and measured. But who does this data belong to? What's being done with it? And how is it going to actually properly influence our lives and improve our health? This is a debate that is raging in the background, behind the scenes, in the regulatory space. And our guest today, Blythe Karow, is in the middle of this conversation due to her knowledge and her expertise. And we're so pleased that she's joining us today. I'm Dr. Desalyn Joseph, and I'm a sleep scientist and circadian rhythm specialist, working at the intersection of how physiological signals can be translated into better health outcomes. Welcome to the Sleep Solutions Lab. So welcome. So today's guest is Blythe. She's a regulatory strategist. She runs her own advisory group, and she's the voice behind the Device Files, which is one of the most popular podcasts. And she is right in the heart of breaking down properly, but really clearly, what is happening with medical device regulation and how this affects us working in the healthcare industry or in health tech. The Blythe has been analyzing what I would view as some of the historical moments in the journey of how regulation is changing. And she really understands, what does it mean for a company? What does it mean for a consumer? And what does it mean for a clinician? So today, let's go deep. So Blythe, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've just been chatting about which time zones we're in and what's happening with our body clocks. So Blythe, let's start with your story. So not only do you work in the health tech industry, but you work in regulation. And for some founders, they run a mile. So they either are at best confused or at worst completely petrified about medical device regulation. So tell us about your journey.
Yeah, and I guess I should start with, I don't know where your audience is tuning in from, but I am 100% US. I know nothing about regulations in other countries. And I'm also 100% medical device. So that can be digital therapeutics, it can be software as a medical device, and it can be wearables that are trying to figure out whether they're in the medical device or they're not a medical device. And so starting, I guess, early days, I'm a nerdy biomedical engineer from Johns Hopkins. And I originally thought I wanted to do pharmaceutical research. My name, Blythe, is actually named after my grandfather, Dr. Blythe, who invented the timed release capsule and did all sorts of amazing research in pharma. And realized when I was in undergrad that I'm actually horrible at research and I find it really boring. But I really enjoy sort of the very complex puzzle it is to get medical devices to the market. And you have to really dive deep into you have to really understand all the customers, all the stakeholders, clinical workflows, everything. And you have to understand it years in advance. You know, if you develop an average app, you can just push it and then be sending out software updates nonstop to tweak it to what the customers need. And you can't do that in medical device. In medical device, you have to know years in advance before you do clinical trials what you want that product to look like, because if you have failure at launch, you have to go back again almost 10 years back sometimes. So it really makes that early understanding hyper important in the medical device space, which has been very interesting. So I've been with big companies like Medtronic, J&J, Boston Scientific, and startups. I had my own startup. And when I rolled out of my startup in 2022, I just sort of fell into fractional work. I had a lot of people asking me to be the CEO of their unfunded startup, and I was totally burnt out at that point. But I like doing the operational side and the strategy side. And of course, I will help people with their due diligence room and communicating with investors, but I let someone else deal with the fundraising. And so I was doing fractional work. And then honestly, I thought, oh, I'll do fractionally until I find a real job. And then I realized about a year and a half ago that this probably was my real job. And part of that was because I found out I have a rheumatological condition and sometimes I just cannot work 100%. And when
Okay.
you're at a traditional corporation,
Yeah.
they don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah.
And so this lets me balance my life. And but this last year has been a real journey. So I created the Karow Advisory Group. I started writing the device files. It
Mm.
also has the podcast in it. I was just very lucky that I decided to start it at the same time that Whoop got their warning letter from the FDA. And I had been playing very heavily in the, are we a medical device or are we
Yeah.
wellness? How
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
stay on which side of the line? I had actually, gosh, maybe 2 years ago, gone very heavily into the process of applying for a PhD program in business so I went to Darden at the University of Virginia for business school. They only open it up every 5 to 7 years, a cohort in ethics and entrepreneurship.
Okay.
And I've been very interested in how I think the investor community drives different behavior in wearable technologies because wearable medical devices have really struggled to get funded, but the Whoops and the Auras of the world could get the right funding through different vehicles.
Yeah.
And so, and sort of like, what does that drive? And I think we're starting to see the results of that now. So, anyway, mentally, I had been in that space for a while. And so I just started talking about it. And it's been a really fun ride since. When it comes to regulatory, I did do a short stint at an FDA regulatory consultancy, but I really wasn't there to do the regulatory part of it. I was there to start a new branch of the company. So it was a really great exposure for me, though, because people don't realize the intricacies of how you talk to the FDA and how it's
Yeah.
different
Yeah. Yeah.
and how each committee, if you're dealing in neurostim, you're going to be talking to different people than if you're doing, blood testing. And they have different histories and different things you want to take into consideration when you're doing these different applications. So I am a product strategist
Yes.
with a robust understanding of the FDA. And I have
Right.
been on quite a learning path to better understand the reimbursement and health economics side of things because at larger corporations, and quite honestly, even when I was in a startup, I was really bad about getting up to speed on that because it's so complex. We always had an expert for it.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, like for example, in the United Kingdom, our FDA equivalent is called MHRA. We had a situation last year where many clinicians were wanting to use AI in their clinical practice, and AVTs or ambient voice technology or AI scribes were becoming really popular. So we had about like 150 different options that we could use if you were permitted to use it, because for some of us we're actually still not allowed to.
Interesting.
And then the MHRA hadn't made a decision. Is this a medical device? Is this not a medical device? Then they made a decision. Yes, it is. It's class one. And we went from 150 products down to 8. So
Wow.
it just cut loads out of the market. And then by the end of last year, we've gone up to the very high number of 12. And I'm just wondering, have you got any like thoughts for founders of startups? Like when should they start to think about regulation really seriously?
So I think there's really two questions in there, right? It's the what does it look like in the US for
Yeah,
scribes, and then when should people start thinking about their regulatory strategy? So
yeah,
I'm not an expert on scribes, and I think that's mostly because in the US we've treated it as being on the non-device side,
okay,
as long as it's a doctor taking notes
yeah,
into the EHR system or whatever their stuff is. I think they probably expect HIPAA compliance to a certain extent. So that's just
sure,
the protection of the data. But I don't think it's been classified as any level of device. If you're carved out as wellness, then you're not
yeah,
a device.
yeah,
And when we talk classes, I think our classes are a little different than yours. I'm not sure, but we have 3 classes of device. So class one, you basically have to follow the right ISO standardization for the FDA,
right,
and it's basically the same, the FDA and ISO. And you need to register with the US and say, we have a tongue depressor, or we have a whatever the class 1 device is, but you don't have to submit to them for any sort of authorization. And there's certainly no clinical testing around it or anything like that. And then we have class 2, and then we have class 3. So I'll jump all the way to class 3. Class 3 is like an implantable device. It's very, it's connected to something very life-threatening. And so they want to be very careful on the clinical data and all of that. And that requires a pre-market authorization, which is a very robust and lengthy submission. And then in the middle, you have your class 2s, which is where most people want to play, where we originally set up what we call a 510K pathway, which you say there is a predicate device that I am just like. And so as long as we function like that predicate, we should be able to get through.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can get a 510K without clinical data. You can just do electrical and whatever other testing to prove that your device functions like the other device. And sometimes there's clinical data involved. And but everybody wants that because the PMA is very robust, and a 510K is a much easier, cheaper, shorter turnaround type of filing. And then we did come up with a new pathway in the last decade called de novo. Maybe it's longer than a decade. But a de novo is, we're still low risk. We're probably similar to another 510K device, but we have a different indication for use that is also low risk. And that is going to typically involve it will involve some sort of clinical data, but it won't be all the way at the level of a PMA because the riskiness of the product is a lot lower. So those are sort of the different areas. I don't know if you needed that full overview, but those are the different areas. And I think we're now, when you talk about AI, there are companies right now working with the FDA on, I know one that just got breakthrough device designation, having some sort of LLM that is communicating with patients post specific procedures to help support them in lieu of clinicians that are too busy to be taking all of these calls. So they are classifying that as a class 2 device right now.
Okay. And do you think that this line between wellness and health, is that line going to hold? Because for some of us, it looks like it's very blurry.
I think it's hard to say anything in the US will hold at this point, given like every new administration wants to throw out, it feels like a banana republic now sometimes. I'm sure people in Europe get quite a dose of this anyway, but we've stopped having a functioning Congress that actually passes things. And so everything gets handled at the bureaucracy level, or the president is doing a whole bunch of executive orders, and then the next president comes in and undoes them. And so it's very volatile, which is frustrating for everyone. I think right now we're seeing a refinement on the wellness side. And so I do think the line is getting clearer. And I think the line is now saying, we don't want to go around hunting after every wellness device to tell them they've crossed the line, but to get truly helpful insight, I think. And I think with the way we're moving towards the quantifiable self, and everybody wants to be measuring things about themselves and being more proactive about their health. I think especially with where our healthcare system is going, probably in the UK as well, it's so hard to get in front of doctors that you don't want to have an initial conversation that then goes, okay, go gather information and come back. And so we want to show up with that information. And so we're at a point where I know we both have Aura rings, like we can see stuff, but is that stuff super helpful? And if we see something is off, do we know what to do with it? And when you start getting to that next stage of what do we do with the information, you really quickly end up on the medical device side of it. And so, so it's interesting. And you had asked, when should people be thinking about this? You need to be thinking about this from the beginning of trying to figure out how your product is going to work. Because if you cross over into the medical device side, it's all about the claims and the indications that you're going after and the level of safety or potential hazard to the client, customer, patient, that is presented by what you're trying to accomplish. And that's how they figure it out. So sometimes you can just be careful about how you talk about it and stay in the wellness side. But other times, if you do that, you're your customer won't understand what you're trying to sell to them, or it just won't have functionality that really gets it to a point where it's useful.
Absolutely. And do you think we're putting so much emphasis on the signal side, on the manufacturing part with FDA regulation? Are we turning our attention enough to, well, what do we do with the data? Like, does the doctor know what that means? Do I know what it means? And then is it actually improving my health? Should we be moving more towards that?
Oh, I think we're inevitably going to be moving more towards that. We are shifting more towards that. And right now, I think the real gap around that is the wearables that are out there and being worn regularly they don't come from a medical device background. And so they see it as quite a burden to have to go through that process. And so they're doing everything they can to really avoid that as much as possible. But I think they're just going to have to at some point accept that to get to the next level, they're going to have medical device clearances. And will that be through their own development versus acquisition? I don't know. I wish they told me these things and had these conversations with me, but they don't. And but I do think we're evolving in that direction. It's a slow slog, and right now they're very much sort of what's the low hanging fruit we can deal with. I think what's also been interesting is right now we have some devices that have medical indications on the software side and what they're doing with the interpretation, and the device is not a cleared medical device. And I don't even know how they're getting around that right now. I probably need to interview someone at the FDA to figure that out. But like the Apple Watch recently got hypertension clearance from the FDA. So it doesn't tell you your blood pressure. Like after a month, it'll tell you if you're showing signs of hypertension.
Yeah.
But I don't believe the Apple Watch itself is actually a cleared medical device.
No,
I'm sure it's manufactured to some ISO standard, but it's not at that level. So the fact that they're allowing people to get clearance on just the software when the device itself hasn't been cleared, I'm kind of shocked that they allowed that line to exist. The same thing happening with Whoop. They have clearance for heartbeats and AFib detection, and I don't think there's a cleared hardware either.
So what do you think this is kind of teaching us about the industry? So for example, we've got that warning because of the blood pressure insights. It triggered a warning from the FDA, and then we didn't all know what was going to happen. You know, some of us as medics are like, look, seriously, it's a diagnostic. And then, you know, others will say, no, it's part of our features. We're not diagnosing anything. What is that teaching us about the industry? So that's that by itself. And then if you add on top of that things like artificial intelligence, and then if you add on top of that things like quantum computing, and, you know, what does it tell us about the industry?
Yeah, well, I don't know if we should take a moment to go through the Whoop history, but I'll talk about what's happening with the industry now. And I have sort of a hypothesis on where this is evolving. We have right now, like the last year, things have changed so drastically for us. A year ago, I just had found out what ChatGPT was, right? I was just starting to use it this time last year, basically, maybe a couple months before that. But now we're interacting with AI, LLMs daily. Many of us have multiple that we're engaging with. We're using it for all sorts of things. And I am as guilty as the next person for giving ChatGPT pictures of my own lab results or my father's and saying, interpret this for us. And on one hand, the CEOs and whatever will come out and they'll say, it's amazing what we can do, and we've helped people uncover all this stuff, but definitely don't give us your personal information because it's not protected. And it's like, but you're advertising that we should do that, and we know that it works, but that's their sort of way of washing their hands of it and saying, well, we're not a medical device because this isn't legit, medical advice. And so but we're already there. So we, over the last year, we're giving it, here are my symptoms. What do you think what's happening? Should I go see a doctor or whatever? But it's this a lot of people are using as a gut check on, is it time to go in and get help from that next stage of healthcare? And then you saw Whoops and Aura and Wearables in the last year go, oh, we need to bring our own LLMs into the platform so that they're asking us instead of then taking it and going to whatever AI they want to work with. So now Whoop will say, okay, we can help you interpret what you're seeing in your own app, right? So that's the next phase that they've got. Well, the next phase, and where I think they're all going, Whoop just did a $575 million raise on a 10 billion plus valuation, which was piggybacked right after, 2 quarters after Aura had a very similar raise in valuation.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about the Whoop raise was that Abbott Labs and Mayo, which is our big medical system, one of them in the US, were in on the raise. Wow. And so, and we talked about this on the device house. Like, what did that mean, right? Why with a company that spent a year probably arguing with the FDA over whether or not this blood pressure was a medical device, why is a medical device company and a healthcare system now investing with them, right? Where are they strategically seeing that future that they decided to get in on that? And we're starting to really rapidly see the signs around that from press releases that are coming out of Whoop. And I think the first one was they announced that they created a sub entity that is physician run, because you kind of have to do that in order to provide a level of clinical care through our national health system, Medicare. And they're going to be using the Whoop bands to monitor a specific chronic condition area and be connecting to this physician-led entity to pipe right into CMS, which are Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, to get reimbursement. So what we're seeing is how can we use our device to start creating patient flow into the healthcare system or manage them? And where I think we're going with this is, you've got your Oura Ring now. It says, here's what your sleep look like. Mine always tells me that I'm not getting enough deep sleep. Shocker. And so I see that all the time. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with that though. Great. Thank you for the insight. They're going to get to the point where they say, okay, you know what we're seeing here is 5 different symptoms that are saying you look like you're struggling with perimenopause. The next step is to say, do you want to get connected to an expert that can help you with perimenopause? And they are going to monetize that connection to a company that does virtual support for perimenopause. They're going to say, we're seeing signs of hypertension. Here's a suggestion on where to go with that. And every suggestion they make for that next connector is going to be monetized, whether they create a sub entity or they just charge for that funnel. And we're going to start to see these wearables replace that first conversation with the GP. It used to be you went to your GP and you said, hey, I'm having these symptoms. And they'll say, we need to get you in front of a specialist that does XYZ. And we're going to be replacing that with technology in the next couple of years. And it's going to happen fast, I think.
This is kind of mind-blowing because even within my own clinical practice, to some of the other doctors, when I say, oh, artificial intelligence, AI, they're like, they're having a bit of a seizure in the corner. And so I spoke to somebody recently in a very prominent and prestigious clinic, and the words that came out of the mouth of the doctor was, I hate AI, because people are worried it's going to take their jobs. And so this is really mind-blowing. And, like as a sleep physician, we don't normally really mind what percentage of deep sleep you have, unless you have none, or unless
I feel better about it.
Yeah. Or unless the distribution is different, because normally it happens at the beginning of the night. So if it's all through the night, we might just ask a question. And it's just, for me, it's with this data, with the huge amount that's being collected, what is the useful interpretation of it? Where is the human in the loop? And then how we get moving to actual better outcomes, better health, better wellness. And there's a whole piece behind that, isn't there? Because the workforce needs to be trained and ready. Pathways have to be rebuilt or redesigned. This is fascinating, really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and when you talk specifically about sleep, that's an interesting one because I worked for a company for 2 years where we were trying to navigate wellness versus medical device, and they were
Yeah,
purposefully monitoring deep sleep to look at indicators around cognitive decline.
right.
So with that cognitive decline, we were looking at what you can do on a wellness side versus not. And the sleep monitoring that they do in Whoop and Aura and whatever other wearable you have, and I should be mentioning Apple and these others when I talk about it, it's actually very accurate. They're able to get a lot, but they're not allowed to tell you a lot. But
No.
I'm amazed at how much they get away with, right? They can
Yeah.
tell you your sleep stages, but it would never, Aura is not telling me it's okay that your deep sleep is only happening in the first part of your sleep because that's normal. They're not telling me that. They
Mm-hmm.
will tell you waking moments, but they can't
Yeah.
use the term sleep apnea.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
therefore, you're missing any quantification around it on the length of it, how awake you got, or how
Yeah.
long,
Yeah.
maybe you weren't breathing or whatever it is. But you can see waking moments, right? And so there's certain lines where if you say you have sleep apnea, that is an indication, and you have now crossed over in a medical device. So I think what wearables can do is already so far beyond what they're actually giving us because they just are making the decision on what to show us and what not to show us. So it's frustrating as someone who understands that and wants more out of my wearable that
Yeah.
I can't get all the information that I want out of it.
One of the questions was, has consumer tech outrun the regulators? Like,
Mm.
are we all keeping up or outrun the clinicians or the healthcare systems?
Mm.
Yeah, what do you think?
I think yes, absolutely we're running ahead of regulation. I think any new tech is ahead of regulation. So,
Yeah.
not totally unfair, but we've already seen that in what's happening with people putting their data into ChatGPT and wanting them to interpret results because what you get out of ChatGPT is better than anything else out there. We used to, what was the website that we used to use like a decade ago where you'd like put in your symptoms and it would output, here are the probabilities that you have like
Yeah.
500 different conditions and they mostly were dumb and weren't applicable. Like, no, I don't have meningitis, and ChatGPT is doing an excellent job of it, but nobody's regulating it. And so I think that's ahead of regulation. They figured out how to monetize it, right? But yeah, the regulation hasn't caught up with it. And then, I think with this sort of future world we're talking about where we're very quickly going to be piping people in different directions, it's going to become monopolistic very quickly. And it's going to be like doctors are not allowed to monetize sending you to your specialist,
No.
right? But Whoop can. Once again, consumer health is leaving the medical industry at a disadvantage and figuring out a way to monetize and profit from it in a way that the regulated side of the industry is not able to. And so it allows them to be more agile and get ahead, and everything else that's trying to play by the rules ends up falling by the wayside.
So is there a way that we could be working much closely together? That's one question. And then my second question is, some of the companies, their standard is quite high. Their VPs of science, they've put a lot of thought into making sure their product is actually quite good. And then there are some companies where their product claims do not match what the device actually does, and they haven't opened up their validation data. So people are really worried there. What do you think about that?
I think all of these companies that we have mentioned think that they are doing things to a very high level
Yeah.
of integrity. They think that they're going about it the right way. And we don't know because they're not giving us the data, right? Whoop is very a closed book, right? Like the new FDA clearance guidance came out around wellness and said, okay, yeah, you can be displaying blood pressure as long as you have clinical evidence that shows that you have some level of accuracy, but they don't say where the bar is on the accuracy, and they don't demand that they show the data, and they have not shown the data to us. And so we're just supposed to believe when they say that they're doing it to this level. So I'm not here to say anybody is not
Yeah.
getting it done to a proper level. I think if you have conversations with them behind scenes, they think they're pretty accurate about that stuff. I don't think a PPG sensor can get where it needs to go on blood pressure. And so, you know, but is some not great data better than no data? It's very hard to have people to walk around with an Omron inflating on their arm every hour, you know? So, you know, there's arguments to be made on either side. What's frustrating to me, and so my two sisters are actually doing a cybersecurity startup. So my sister dives into like data privacy all the time. These are companies, and I'm going to generally say like Silicon Valley or tech companies. They came up in a world where they made their money on data, and that data is your data. And they are legally now selling Aura, Whoop, all of them, tons of data about you legally. The amount of legal data brokering that happens is terrifying. My sister just did a TED talk on it. If I can find it, I'll send it to you. It's terrifying what they can already give out about you. And to think that we're going to be, that right now they're monitoring biosignals and all these other things that are not being properly regulated, and that they're just going to continue to add interpretation and insight to that when we haven't properly, I think, locked down what they can do with that data and how it's getting packaged. And it's not just them, right? Like Meta, if you end up in a support group on Facebook for a certain disease state, you end up in a data brokering on people who have this disease state who can be then manipulated based on that. If you end up in a suicide, you know, support thing, you are going to be identified as someone that is suicidal, and that can be manipulated in some way because of that. These are terrifying things, right? And so, and those data brokers, they can figure out who you are and all the different things that are connected to you, your Aura, your Facebook, your whatever, and they connect the dots on the back end and package it and sell it for like a couple cents, you know? So it's somewhat terrifying. And that's one of my biggest concerns actually is, you know, I've met the people inside Whoop and Aura. They're nice people. They come from good backgrounds, but they have really ignored hiring on people from the medical device industry. And they don't think like that. You know, I wrote an article on this new term of clinical product manager and calling it tech med instead of med tech, because they continue to say we're not medical device and we don't need to learn from the people that are in that space. And therefore we're going to create our own ecosystem with our own terminology. And so they want a clinical product manager, and all they're doing is figuring out how to use the data to get the insights, but they're not people that operate from a level of the, you know, if you grew up in medical device, you're constantly thinking patient safety first, patient privacy first. And it's just a different mentality that is not baked into what they're doing.
So maybe regulation is changing, like the backdrop with AI in there is changing, and maybe the company's approach might need to change as well, especially if there's a walk which looks like it's steadily going into healthcare. So to kind of sum things up, what would you, I've asked people this before, like AI, thumbs up, thumbs down, like the future of med tech, or whatever phrase people are calling it, tech med. What do you think?
I am using it.
Yes.
I'm using it robustly. Don't want to be a dinosaur who doesn't understand agentic AI 2 years from now, because we all need to get there in terms of, and so we are building into, you know, if you want to think about, you know, the robots are going to take over or whatever it is, we're marching straight towards it. I don't think any one person saying, well, I'm not interacting with AI because it is going to stop that march, right? So, you know, it's terrifying. To me, it's, you know, the entire world in terms of how we operate is acting like the stock market jumping on whatever new fad. It's like the tulip trade. We're all jumping in on this fad and wanting to get in on it. We're not making money off of it. We're giving them our money, but we're all jumping on it because we see where the tide is going. can I say that it's safe and that I think it's going to, all work out lovely? There are going to be stumbling blocks. I'm sure it's not being developed in the safest way. It's fascinating to hear about, how Claude has like an on-hand ethicist and, things around how they deal with the AI and everything, because what we're hearing is somewhat terrifying. And even in my own interactions with it, like I give it ground rules on how I want it to operate. And then it doesn't do what I told it to do.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, didn't we set these rules? Why aren't you following the rules we set? And it's like, and it's because we wanted to save energy on the back end and processing. And so we didn't want to go through the whole thing of looking at your notes and doing all this and just wanted to throw something out. And so it's constantly doing things that are advantageous to it, or how the company has defined what's advantageous, even though you think you've locked it down. So I'm at a point where I can't even trust that it's doing my back office the way I want it to. And here I am already giving it my medical data. So yeah, it's not a safe place for us to be playing in, but we're doing it anyway. But we do that, I mean, like the data packaging. Yeah. How many apps have people downloaded in the last 2 years to play a game? And the amount of data that's getting scraped off the back end when you're doing that is just bonkers.
So let's end with some quick fire questions.
Okay.
If one regulation you would remove tomorrow, what would it be?
Ooh, I mean, can I say our entire healthcare system is a mess? It's so complex. And every time I talk to people who worked at the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, they'll come up with like this but that's not how the system works. And we have to work within the system. The system is a mess. And so, transitioning to value-based care away from just getting paid for all these procedures would make me very happy. I don't think that's one regulation. It's pretty wide sweeping, but I want to see that progress.
Next question. Wellness or medical, will that distinction remain?
Yes, there will always be, I mean, at least in the United States, it's to a certain extent that is regulation based.
Yeah.
So they created a wellness carve out in Congress with a law. And so the FDA can't just turn that around.
Okay, next one. One mistake that is very common with founders in medical device space.
I could list off a bunch. I think big picture is to really fully be marching down the right path in your product development. You need to have clearly defined where you're trying to get to. Who are you trying to treat or diagnose or whatever, and how are you going to be doing that? Whose hands will that be in? Does it fit into the clinical workflow? Is there reimbursement for it? What does the regulatory look like? You need to have talked to all of those specialists and worked that into your model, or you're going down the wrong path probably. And when an investor is reviewing your documents, they really quickly can see whether or not you have that figured out.
That was a comprehensive answer for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think, it's hard to say, oh, they didn't talk to a regulatory specialist or they didn't talk to a reimbursement, but it's a business plan is a complex strategy that all fits together. And if one piece is off, it can throw off the rest of it.
Thank you. That's good advice. My very, very last question, which maybe it's going to get edited out or maybe answer it in code. Is there one company or is there like a group of companies that you think are getting it right or trying really hard?
Well, I think that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of medical device companies that are in the pre-seed startup tech transfer out of university phase that I've been playing so deeply in this space in the last decade. They are trying to get funding to get from here to there. And they haven't been able to get the funding from the medical device world, where the Whoops and the Auras have been able to accelerate way past them by getting funding from a different area. And so they're all these sort of nameless companies you've never heard of because they've been walking through scientifically and medically the right steps and haven't gotten there yet. And so, I worry that we're at a point where none of them will get there because they've been leapfrogged so effectively by the wearable companies that are already out there. But I hope we're going to see a lot more medical device that is, there's so much in wearable and like wearable stim and things like that, where it could be non-invasive. It doesn't have the side effects of drugs. You know, there's so much advantage to it, and it's just not getting there. So there's not like one company that's fully commercialized that I would point at, but the fact that there are so many that you haven't heard of.
Great, thank you. And do you think the future of health is brighter because wearables is part of that kind of journey and conversation?
I do. I mean, I think that we are getting slowly smarter about our health. I think especially in women's health, where for so long we were not treated as a different type of body than a men's body or a man's body. And we're still at the point where trying to figure out what's going on with our hormones, we're just individual science experiments. Let's try this drug. Oh, my hair's falling out. Well, let's stop that one. Let's try this drug. Well, now I'm growing hair in weird places. Let's stop that. So like nobody knows what's going on with each individual. And I think we're going to get there, which is great. I think on the flip side of that, my warning is that as we become obsessed with the quantifiable self, there's also studies coming out about how mentally tracking that stuff regularly might not be good for you psychologically. Sure. And just opening up your Aura app in the morning to check how my sleep was, how do I feel when I wake up in the morning, right? And so we need to be careful about that balance.
Thank you. Your insights are so rich and so deep, like seriously. So what I'm taking from this conversation is that we're not building devices anymore. It's not just hardware or software. We're actually building new health ecosystems that influence behavior, influence decisions, and hopefully influence health. It's been great speaking to you today. And congratulations on all the fantastic work that you're doing with your advisory group and the information that we get clearly from the device files, and hopefully we'll get the opportunity to speak again in the future.
Oh, it's been awesome. Thank you for having me on. I'm happy to, check back in on a regular basis if you want. Maybe we'll figure out a way to post this conversation on the device files.
Thank you. That would be great. Thank you. Yeah. If you found this episode useful and valuable, share it with someone working in the health tech space or someone who's using it, because the future of healthcare still depends on regulation and it being done well.